let's talk about Type 2 falchions. Type 2 falchions, also sometimes called reverse edge falchions, because the edge on these is on the concave side, so the opposite side is the side you'd expect on both of these. Type 2 falchions is a name that comes from the Elmslie typology for falchions. So I'll just call these Type 2s. These are two, I don't have any live versions unfortunately, these are two plastic simulators made by Black Fencer. This is their standard catalog Type 2 falchion, available for order online. This is a custom version, which originally I had asked them, in fact, for a custom version of, I don't remember if it was the Clooney or the Conyers falchion, the biggest one of the two. I think it's the Conyers, if I remember. Anyway, doesn't matter. But so that's what I got. That's what they made me. They made me a really cool falchion, which was therefore broad all the way to the tip. So it had a broad spatulate cutting tip, as you expect on those type of falchions. And I modified this myself essentially because I thought that a Type 2 falchion was a more appropriate tool for doing interesting, controlled sparring. And also, I simply wanted to have two of these to be able to try sparring one-on-one with this type of falchion. We used bucklers with them as well. So, I'll just put this one down and keep a hold of the custom one. So, I was inspired to make this video by a video that Matt Easton put out, Matt Easton from Scholagladiatoria put out about a year ago, showing some appreciation for these falchions, which I agree with him are underappreciated and probably not known about as much as they should be. And personally, they've always been really one of my very favorite types of swords because of how optimal they are. I'll get into that in just a second. Just so happens that another one of my type of favorite swords was used around the same time period as these. You see a waster version of one of them behind me here, Type 14 arming swords. So what time period was that? Well, these swords in art, off the top of my head, I've looked at a bunch of images of these. I think in art they're most depicted between about 1280, 1290 to about 1340, 1350. There are probably outliers before and after those dates, but so essentially in the first half of the 14th century, which is also roughly the time when the Type 14 arming swords are most popular and most in use. So it's not infrequent to find manuscripts where every man-at-arms is shown using one of these or a Type 14. Speaking of Type 14s, let me get out a waster of a Type 14, since this is representative of the main, or one of the most popular other options of sword to be used at this time period, and to go through really what are the advantages and disadvantages of this sword. So what I find really amazing about these swords is something that Matt Easton really went over himself to some degree, or mentioned at least, is the fact that they have within them a lot of the advantages of other swords combined. Now, I would put it this way. These swords are, to me, are functionally so exceptional. I mean, not to mention they're aesthetically very interesting as well. They look kind of like something that comes out of a fantasy movie. But from a functional perspective, they are so exceptional because most swords in history tend to fall into, I would say, one of three categories. They tend to be either highly specialized towards cutting, in which case they don't make so good thrusters, right? So like, for example, the Conyers types falchion, which will have a big, broad spatulate tip all the way to the tip, which makes it essentially rubbish at thrusting, and exceptionally good at cutting, including all the way at the tip, right? Or they tend to be swords like small swords or rapiers or estocks, or a lot of arming swords and two-handed swords from slightly after this time period with thick diamond cross sections, strong tapers, etc. Right? So in other words, they tend to be swords that are optimized for the thrust and that are relatively poor performers in cutting. So that would be the second category. Third category that swords fall in is probably the most common throughout history, which is some form of compromise between cut and thrust. And what I mean by compromise is these middling swords will tend, therefore, to be both less good thrusters than optimized thrusting swords and less good cutters than optimized cutting swords, while still being reasonably good at both of those things. I find so interesting about these is that they're one of, if not the only, sword in history that I would feel pretty comfortable saying goes beyond compromise, right? Because this is undoubtedly a cut and thrust sword. I would say it goes beyond compromised in that it comes pretty damn close to being both a specialized cutting sword and a specialized thrusting sword. That's what's so cool and so unusual about this sword. And the reason for that, of course, is this cutout, which allows allow these to have slender tips, right, with an optimal taper to achieve good penetration. Also, you can't, obviously I can't show you any blade geometry, any interesting blade geometry in this plane on this example since it's a plastic simulator, but these tips on the originals tend to be reinforced tips, right? So very optimized for thrusting, especially against the armor of the day, which would have been predominantly mail armor. So very good thrusting capacity, and the blades of these tend to be like typical Falchion and Messer blades, very thin blades with a very very acute angle toward the edge that you could get very sharp, right? So this sword really combines those two functions to quite an extraordinary degree. So that is really the main thing that I want to say here. The main advantage, I would say, of these swords is that they are optimized cut and thrust swords to a degree that really goes beyond typical compromise. However, of course, you can never completely escape compromise. There are some compromises in this sword design. Which compromises would those be? Well, the most obvious one, I guess, is that this broad, thin cutting blade doesn't extend all the way to the tip, right? So you still have the type of cutting power you would get with a Condius-type falchion here around the center of percussion. You don't get it at the tip, right? So the tip itself would probably be pretty poor at cutting, especially when it's a reinforced tip that would make a sort of diamond section around the tip that would be pretty poor at cutting. Are there any compromises in terms of the thrust? I mean, it depends which swords you compare it to. Obviously, this relatively thin blade is going to be relatively flexible. Not that the flex of this plastic one is necessarily representative of a steel one, although it probably is relatively similar, honestly. But that is unavoidably going to have some flex for the following reason. If you make a blade very broad and very thin to optimize its cutting power, you cannot at the same time very easily make it very thick or give it a very thick spine. You of course could do that, but that would be increasing the mass in both directions and thereby increasing the weight of the overall object quite substantially. And these swords, of course, tend to be well within range of typical one-handed swords, so they are pretty nimble. Even though the weight distribution does make them handle in slightly peculiar ways. I'll get to that in just a minute. So there is, of course, a slight compromise to both the cutting and the thrusting ability, but it is extremely slight, which is really the very cool thing about these swords. What more could you say in terms of compromises to thrusting? Can you half-sword with a sword like this? First off, I don't know if half-swording was a thing in this time period. That's something I would have to look up. I mean, this is the early 14th century, so this is around the time of the I-33 manuscripts. It's really the beginning of fencing manuscripts, so all the examples of half-swording in manuscripts I can think of are obviously significantly later. You would have to find examples of half-swording in medieval art, of which, frankly, I know none in this time period, but there may well be some. It's just not something that I've researched. But assuming you would want to, could you half-sword with this? Well, the fact that it's a very broad blade makes half-swording pretty difficult. Blades that are optimal for half-swording, well, they tend to not have very acute edges, right? Like an S-stock, for example, has a thick diamond section blade. But even if it does have acute edges, you really want something relatively thin so that you can wrap your hand around it and apply a lot of pressure along the side and not so much dig your hand into the edge itself. If you try to hold on to something this broad, you are going to be digging your fingers into the edge, which I would think this would be pretty uncomfortable for half-swording. However, they do have blunt backs. I mean, most of them, so far as I know, are sharpened to some degree on the false edge, which I simulated on this one using tape. I don't know if you can see that. I use tape on these That's just a tip. If you use synthetic wasters, if you tape them up, they will bind better. They will be less slidey amongst each other. So I put some tape down here, part of the way, to simulate a false edge. But assuming there is a back edge that goes at least half the way up, possibly more, which is I think how the originals tend to be, you could of course half sword by putting your hand simply over the blunt back edge without actually wrapping your fingers around the sharp edge, and use it to half sword in such a way. And this actually doesn't feel too bad. I think this could totally be used. You would perhaps have a slightly less good grip on the sword if you were half swording and needing to parry heavy blows from something else. If this gets hit hard, it's more likely to exit my grip. So it's not optimized for half swording, I'd say, but you can do it. In other words, all the compromises I can think of are all really pretty mild and pretty insignificant. So that's the main advantage. The main advantage is that this is really good at cutting, really good at thrusting, with very few compromises to both of those things. Now, what are some other advantages of this sword? Well, there are at least two that I can think of that Matt Easton in his video didn't mention and that I think are really worth mentioning. Matt Easton talked about the penetrative power of these swords, which everyone loves. The cool thing is, despite how good they are at penetration, this angle here will have two functions to add two advantages to the already existing list. One of them, in regards to thrusting, is that this will prevent over-penetration, right? So that might not be needed in the case of thrusting against mail armor, because against mail armor, you are going to be meeting a lot of resistance. If you successfully burst one of the links in the mail, you likely will get caught a bit further down on a bunched group of rings, and so over-penetration when going through mail might not be the biggest issue, depending on how much force you can apply, which blade you're using, etc. But that might not be the biggest issue. However, these were of course used in a time when not everyone would have had mail armor, and not every part of an opponent's body might be covered in mail. And so to the degree that you would use this to thrust into unarmored parts of an opponent, this angle here will be extremely good for preventing over-penetration, and this amount of penetration is really plenty for pretty much any target. That's deep enough for doing serious damage on pretty much any target. So that is a potentially significant advantage of these swords. An even more significant advantage, I think, still has to do with this shape here, and it has to do with manipulating and controlling your opponent's weapons. Now, this is something that we noticed straight away when using these to do sword and buckler sparring, is this angle here can be used to, in binds, to push against the opponent's blades. Maybe I'll take a straight blade so we don't get confused, right? So this is a trainer for a type 14 arming sword. So you can push against the opponent's blade, and it really requires a substantial movement and time in sparring terms to get beyond this angle here. Even though it can slide, it can just slide past, right? But depending on where you put your, how you put your momentum, how you put how you angle the corner, you can really catch things with this and push them away, which is something you can do with very few other swords. Usually with a sword, you can only push with the tip, and you can only push with the tip against flat surfaces that are pointing towards you, like an opponent's shield, for example. Now, when you push a shield with the tip, there is chance, if you use too much force, that the tip gets stuck in it. With this, you can not only push your opponent's blade, you can come down. If your sword tip gets caught under crossguard, you can push into the crossguard and or hand, right? And that will really twist the sword around. You can push into the edge of a buckler to flip it open and create an opening. You can push into a shield. You can push many things with this, which is extremely useful. Now, I haven't done a huge amount of sparring with these, and everything I've done, I believe, actually I think I did try it with some heater shields, but most of what I've done was sparring with sword and buckler. I would be very curious, though, to try this against, for example, spears, right? To see against pole arms how much extra time and maneuverability this gives you. The fact that you are able to potentially parry an attack from a spear very far from your body, to parry something all the way up here instead of parrying with the edge and having it slide up to the crossguard. So essentially this angle gives you something to work with that is akin to a crossguard very far from your hand, right? And that allows you to do all kinds of sort of anticipative parries where you block a weapon or push it or make it have to take a longer trip around to get near your hands. And you can do all of that very far from your hands, which is really a significant advantage, and I think this is something that has to be explored quite a bit more in sparring. So I've gone over essentially 3 advantages of these swords, just to recapitulate briefly. The first one is that it is optimized towards both thrusting and cutting. Second one is that this angle here would have the added benefit of preventing over-penetration. And third one, and possibly one of the most notable ones for someone doing HEMA and sparring, is the fact that this angle gives you a lot of options for manipulating other people's weapons. Now, do these swords have any disadvantages? Why would people fighting in the time period when these swords were used choose to use, for example, a Type 14 or any other of the more standard typical arming swords that were available at the time instead of one of these falchions? That's a good question. I can't think of any extremely debilitating or severe disadvantages that these falchion have, but I am going to mention a few disadvantages. First disadvantage is aesthetic, right? These are cool looking, but they're definitely weird looking. They definitely look like something that comes out of fantasy, right? And I suspect that they would have had that look for people of that time as well, simply because this type of sword, even at the time it was used, was probably never the most common, right? More standard looking arming swords were probably always more common, even in the time when these were used. And their period of use doesn't span for that long. 50 years, 70 years maybe, where they were at their most popular. The outliers might be still a bit further in time than that, but they were not used for such a prolonged period of time. So I suspect that most people who were around when these were being used probably, like us, thought that they looked a bit weird, a bit like a fantasy sword, something like that. A bit like something out of mythology. And for that reason, the standard kind of more pure, more straight lines, more symmetrical aesthetic of the traditional types of arming sword may have been aesthetically more appealing to some people at the time, which is quite speculative, but that would be my guess. Second disadvantage would be nimbleness, or likely nimbleness. Now, I'm making inferences based on the mass distribution of these two simulators. I do own a live version of a Type 14 sword, but it's quite different to this model. It's a bigger one, so it's not a particularly useful comparison here. However, I have to say these Black Fencer swords do tend to be very realistic in terms of their mass distribution and their handling characteristics. Now, if I assume this is representative of the actual swords, what do I think about how these move? They're similar. But this has some interesting characteristics. It is slightly more, what would you say? I was going to say axe-like, but not really. The fact you have a lot of mass here makes it want to easily move around the point, sort of like certain longswords do. Certain Langesmesser move like that as well. Actually, that's what this feels like to me. This feels like a messer that is on the heavier side. I feel like I could definitely quite easily do spar using techniques from Lekukner against a person using a messer with this. It would be a bit long, it would be a bit heavy, but it feels and moves quite a bit like a messer. This, on the other hand, so the Type 14 arming sword, it pivots less around the actual point. It pivots somewhere a bit further down, right? So the point stays aligned. The point doesn't want to stay on line as much when you move around the grip. However, it is a little bit faster in cuts. It is a little bit better balanced, you could say. The balance is definitely more in your hand, right? The thickest part of the blade is right here near your hand. So the differences are subtle, I have to say, but I would say that this is probably a bit more nimble, and that you can probably move the tip around a little bit faster, engage and disengage a little bit faster with this type of sword, whereas the falchion, I would be inclined to use it probably more often with more of a hammer grip, and perhaps using motions that involve more of the elbow and the shoulder, more of my entire arm. So the handling is a bit different. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage, though? Depends on the situation and what you're looking for, I would think. But anyway, I would suspect that these arming swords would be on average slightly more nimble, at least for the same type of length sword, which these two swords, these two wasters anyway, are very comparable in length and in pretty much everything else. Third disadvantage, and this is a disadvantage that is only valid in comparing it to Type 14 swords, and it is a pretty minor disadvantage. Type 14 swords have the following advantage. Because they have such a broad base, they do offer some more hand protection. So when another sword is coming in and gets caught on the crossguard, the angulation that creates, the blade is kept, basically the enemy's blade is kept further away from my fingers, and a stronger angle is required for the blade edge to start interacting with my fingers, simply because this broad blade keeps this corner further from my knuckles. The thinner the blade is, the closer this corner is to the knuckles, and the less angulation that the blade needs in order to be able to touch the fingers. A very mild disadvantage, I think you'll agree, but nonetheless, one of the ones I thought I would mention. Fourth and final disadvantage is not in regards to the use of the sword, it's more in regard to wearing it. How significant a disadvantage would this be is an interesting question. And that is simply scabbard construction. So, I don't have scabbards for either of these swords, but I think you'll agree, fairly obviously based on looking at the shape of these blades, with most swords where they taper only in one direction, so regardless of the variation of the taper, of the profile taper, or distal taper for that matter, they taper only in one direction, so they only ever get thinner, or they might continue on the same thickness and then get thinner again. Which means that the scabbard you make for a sword like this can sit flush against the edge for the entire shape of the sword. So you can have a very tightly fitting scabbard. Obviously, with a sword like a Type 14 falchion, where the widest part of the blade is very far from the mouth of the scabbard, would be all the way at the back of the scabbard, that means that every part of the scabbard that goes after this part has to be of equal thickness, so that you can get the sword in. So the mouth of the scabbard would have a width something like this. In other words, it would be roughly twice too wide for what it would need to be if the entire sword was this width or less. That means that the scabbard arrangements are going to be somewhat funky, right? So you're probably going to need a scabbard that remains very wide throughout, and then some method of making sure that the sword in that wide scabbard mouth doesn't rattle back and forth all the time. So perhaps you'll have a string, a leather strap, something that you can strap the sword flush against one of the edges of the scabbard mouth so it doesn't move around, something like that. But so you will have potentially more rattling problems. You will also have a too big scabbard mouth, which creates potential for water getting in more easily, and that kind of issue. So I think the scabbards would be somewhat fidgety. Is that a huge problem? Well, if you have some kind of strap to attach this in the scabbard to make sure it doesn't rattle, that also means that you can't draw it as fast. If you want to be able to draw it in a single motion with one hand, you probably need to not have it attached in any way. In other words, to have this being loose in a too big scabbard mouth, which means that depending on the quality of the construction and the tightness in other parts, this might rattle around quite a bit, which might damage the scabbard and give the scabbard a less long life, which might be annoying for other reasons as you're wearing the thing. So that is possibly a consideration. How significant is not easy for me to say. Alright, so to recapitulate, this is a really cool type of sword. What are its primary advantages and disadvantages based on other arming swords that were used at the time, such as this one? Well, primary advantage is it is both optimized for cutting and for thrusting. It would be a better cutter than Type 14 swords, which are already phenomenal cutters. It would not necessarily be a better thruster. The tips on these two plastic ones are not necessarily that significant, but the tips on historical ones tend to be relatively close. However, I do think that the tips on these falchions do tend to be somewhat thinner. They also tend to be more reinforced. So you may be able to say that compared to the swords of the time, they are actually better at cutting and better at thrusting than the arming swords. That is really the main thing, the main hype, I think, about this sword. Second advantage is this tip will prevent overpenetration. Third advantage, which actually is also really one of the significant ones according to me, is that it will allow you to use this angle to manipulate your opponent's weapons and create binds and create a corner with which you can push that you don't have with any other sword I can think of. Although you do have it with halberds, for example. Now, disadvantages, 4 main disadvantages. The scabbard arrangements for a sword like this are complicated compared to a straightforward sword that tapers evenly. The nimbleness is a bit lesser than a sword that has a more traditional taper. This is a bit more tip heavy, I guess. The tip, anyway, this whole part, which is quite massive, kind of tends to want to stay in one place or to accelerate with a significant amount of mass and inertia, so less nimbleness. Also, the aesthetic is less traditional. That might be a disadvantage for some people. And the slightly reduced protection to the hands compared to a Type 14 sword, which has a wide base. But this comparison isn't valid for all the swords that are in use at this time. So those are the main things that I could come up with. Now, if you consider this, finally, if you consider this sword in a more broad setting, are there any other disadvantages that would be worth noting? I mean, surely this sword isn't optimized for all contexts. And the answer is, of course, it's not optimized for all contexts. So far, I've mainly compared it to other swords of its time, and I simplified even that by looking basically at a Type 14 sword that was around the same length, which is the most similar sword available at the time. But there were other swords being used at that time, including swords that were significantly longer and didn't have the shape of the Type 14 sword. So this sword was probably not optimized for use on horseback, for example. They don't tend to have a huge amount of reach, although they are shown in art used from horseback, but they're probably not optimized for that purpose. They are probably also not optimized for civilian use. Now, were there many swords in the early 13th century optimized for civilian use? I'm not sure. There might have been. If there were, it doesn't seem like this was one of them. They are pretty overbuilt for a civilian purpose. They definitely seem to be swords made for war. Is their hand protection optimized? If you look in a broader context, no. At this time period, there virtually were no other swords with more hand protection, although you do occasionally find, even this early, knuckle bows in art, but that's extremely rare. And I think even noggles on messers and stuff like that are a slightly later thing, although I'm not too sure. So basically, right, this isn't a sword that is good at everything in any context, in any time period necessarily. However, it is very impressive the degree to which it combines cutting power with thrusting power, especially when you compare it to the weapons of its time, and especially when you put it in the context of warfare and armor of its time. This is really a beast to be reckoned with, I would say. So, thank you for watching. I hope you found this interesting. I hope this makes you love this sword a little bit more. And if you're interested in getting into trying things out with this in sparring, I think this is, not only is this an underappreciated sword in general, it is definitely an underappreciated sword for sparring, because even though the breadth of this means that it doesn't flex very much and it hits hard, so it's never going to be an optimal sword for tournament settings or things like that. With a bit of control, it is a very fun sword for use in sword and buckler. I imagine it's probably very interesting for Sword and Shield as well. So if you're into that kind of thing, I think it's definitely worth getting a pair of these, for example, from Black Fencer, who make them in nylon, and using them for some experimental sparring practice. I hope you enjoyed all of this and found it interesting. Thank you for your attention. So long. And the last thing I forgot to mention. You remember at the beginning of this video I said this was a custom Black Fencer that originally was a Cogniet's type falchion. In other words, brought all the way to the tip. And basically I realized that I didn't have so much use for that type of falchion for sparring, so I didn't really need a nylon version of it. And I decided to convert this myself into a Type 2 falchion by removing part of that tip, which just brought something to mind for me. When you look at these images in art, the representations in art, these swords are sometimes represented side by side with Cogniet's type falchions, so falchions that are brought all the way to the tip. They are sometimes represented side by side, and they sometimes look extremely similar other than for the different cutout shape over here. However, the surviving examples that I have looked at before, I've never seen any of them in person, but the surviving examples that I have looked at in photographs, they do seem to have different blade profiles. So they do seem to have been two different specialized weapons, at least to some degree. But the thought that just crossed my mind is it conceivable that some people back in the day did the same modification as I just did with my training waster right here, for whatever reason? So for example, someone might have owned a falchion that was brought all the way to the tip, and then they find out that they are going to go on a military campaign where they're likely going to be fighting against big numbers of armored opponents. Would it be possible with that type of broad thin falchion to simply remove a lot of the material, such as to create a narrow thrusting tip, in which case the tip would not be reinforced unless it already was on the broad falchion, which it wouldn't be. So you wouldn't have a reinforced tip in that case. Would someone do that? Possibly. Possibly. Would they end up like this for other reasons? Like, say, for example, you have a broad spatulate Cogniet's type falchion, and it's seen a lot of use, and these falchions being so good at cutting near the tip might be one of the places that suffers a lot of damage. If you had suffered a lot of damage on your sword around the tip by regrinding, etc., would you end up with something rather asymmetrical that ends up being where you end up transforming it to the point where it looks like something like this? That might be a bit more unlikely. However, you might just get like one big rolled edge, one big crack, a lot of damage near the tip, which would make you want to modify your sword in this way. Could those two reasons combine? Might these broad falchions, which I think were in existence a bit earlier, might, through wear and use and all the factors I just mentioned, perhaps someone modifying them in order to be able to thrust better, might that have been the original impetus behind the idea of making these as a specialized design, making these looking like this from the start? I have no idea. I don't have any evidence for that, but that's just a possible hypothesis that comes from the fact that I myself had a broad falchion and decided to suit my purposes to remove the cutting edge up here and turn it into a specialized thrusting tip. Just a last thought to leave you with.